All right, good morning and welcome to this session. I'm Dr. Elizabeth Cruson. My co-chair for these sessions is Dr. Antoinette Vicks. She is managing all of the things behind the scenes. She and I are both full-time faculty in a psychology program with the Department of Behavioral Sciences. And so we hope you enjoy this session. Most of you probably know our speakers, so feel free in the chat to jump in and say hi and connect there. I am going to turn it over to Tricia and Leah. Tricia is the Vice President of Learning, Assessment, and Curricular Affairs, and in my view, a jack of all trades, as she is very good at lots of things and has a lot of responsibility. Leah Belshi is the Student Access and Wellness Manager and the Title IX Coordinator for the university. And they're going to talk to us today about empowering a culture of care by developing inclusive environments for individuals with disabilities. So that has lots of implications, curricular and otherwise, for those of us in online education and higher education. We will, if we get to the end and we have time, we'll have a bunch of time for questions, or they may take questions as we go. But with no further ado, I would like to introduce Tricia and Leah, and they can go ahead and take off with their presentation.
Thank you very much, Liz, and it's a privilege to be here today with Leah and with all of you to have a conversation. So please feel free to jump in with questions throughout our time together, where we'd like to visit with you about how we collectively can embody a culture of care by developing an inclusive environment for individuals with disabilities. Leah and I felt like it was very important to start our session sharing the UAGC Culture of Care pillars, because they are very meaningful to us. You may be curious about the two of us presenting on this topic based on our very different roles in the university. However, as Liz somewhat alluded to in her introduction, that's exactly why we're here together today. Our collective commitment to the pillars shown here is probably best articulated through a story I would like to share with you. And it's actually the story of how our paths initially crossed. Several years ago, in fact, Leah, I went back and looked, and it was actually about 4 years ago.
Oh, wow. That sounds like yesterday.
I know. A faculty member reached out to me with a bit of a challenge. This individual really wanted to incorporate an activity for students to help them develop skills in order for them to master their learning outcomes and for them to demonstrate mastery of their learning outcomes. But she realized that the technology was not fully accessible and would not be inclusive to all learners. And so she really wanted some help thinking about what she could do to ensure the best possible success for learning for all students. And sometimes that involves coming up with an alternate assignment, or sometimes that might mean advocating with the third-party vendor to ensure accessibility for all. So I decided to connect with Leah Belsley, who I had never connected with before, to see if she was willing to tackle this project together. So Leah and I had an initial conversation, decided we needed to bring in a few more stakeholders to support this faculty, and through about a 6-month process, we found a solution that worked for everyone, notably faculty and students alike. We were very excited and were celebrating our success, and in that reflection knew that we couldn't stop the great work that we had started there, even though it was just one class across all the 1,200 courses we offer at UAGC. We knew at that moment that we needed to ensure an inclusive and engaging learning environment for all. And Leah and Tricia's norms, while implicit, were actually founded in these 5 pillars. So you can imagine when these were shared broadly with us at UAGC, that Leah and I said to one another, hey, that's us. We communicate with one another. In fact, I would say we probably connect no fewer than twice a week. We advocate for doing what's right for all stakeholders, whether it be accessibility of our university website, faculty, students. We have the utmost respect for one another, and sometimes we have to have difficult conversations with one another, but we know we're coming at it from a place of being student-centric. And I hope that Leah feels empowered when she works with me, and I know I feel that way with her. So with that said, I'd like to turn the presentation over to Leah. Thank you.
Thanks, Trisha. Yeah, I'm so appreciative of everybody who's joining us today, and it has been a great pleasure to work with Trisha on this work. And I love that we get to share what we're so passionate about with everybody who joined us today. What I'd like us to kind of start with is to take a journey and look at where we have been, what we can learn from our past, where we can go from here, and some steps we can take to get there. So we're going to take a look at some events surrounding disability rights and their beginnings. We're going to define some important terms and look at the lasting impacts of an old model of disability. And then we'll think about how we can start to leverage a culture of care to review, the tools that would increase equity and higher education, but also the workplace and your local community. So what is disability? It's a normal part of the human experience. 1 in 4 people in the US and more than 1 billion people in the world have a disability. And all kinds of disabilities exist. Some are visible while others are not. And each person has a different experience with their disability and their environment. But we do share some commonalities. We all have families, parents, children, loved ones. Disability is just a normal part of our human experience. It affects all of us, all genders, races, ages, religions, and cultures. Some may have acquired a disability later in life, while others might be born with it. The next slide, please. I want to kind of take a look again, like I said, some of the places that we started. And in their beginnings, both Section 504 and the Americans with Disability Act, we had to have people pull together to make change happen. Disability rights activists pulled together to fight for disability justice and ensure these laws were enforced. It takes a village. So in 1977, 4 years after Section 504 was signed into law, it still wasn't implemented, and activists all over the nation occupied government property to push for implementation. In the first picture, what we see is a group of activists who, for almost a month, took over the 4th floor of the Health, Education, and Welfare building in San Francisco. Then, jump forward, similarly in 1990, about 1,000 people demonstrated barriers that inaccessibility can create. They marched from the White House in Washington to the Capitol building, and the push here was to display the importance for the ADA to pass. As depicted in the second image, what we can see is marchers, when they got to the steps of the Capitol building, some people left behind their mobility devices, their walkers, wheelchairs, and they crawled up the steps. Both of these were very powerful movements that made a great deal of impact in disability and social justice. So these events highlight how we can work together for access and social justice. And compliance laws, I'll note, are such a good place to start, but they're not the finish line. These are the things that we have to do to be compliant, but it's not all we can do. These laws certainly have, reduced barriers, but we need to recognize that there's still many people out there who face obstacles to fully participating in society, including living, learning, and in the employment arena. So currently what we see in this arena is consideration being given to what updates are needed within these regulations to ensure web and digital accessibility. The internet was just simply not thought of when these regulations were drafted. So we can go ahead to the next slide. Thank you. You're on it with the slides today, Trisha. I don't even...
Had my coffee.
There we go. Great. So what is considered a disability? The legal term from the ADA defines a person with a disability as someone who has a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities. And we're going to dive in the next slide here about a model of disability and where this definition may have came from. But what I want to note is an important item here. The spirit of this definition has a lot of good pieces to it. It's meant to be applied broadly so no one is left behind. But it might also identify some stereotypes that people continue to navigate as it highlights limitations. The definition itself is meant to add legal rights for disability, for individuals with disabilities and prevent discrimination. Yet it does seem to reinforce this idea that disability is a medical condition. It's not necessarily a normal occurrence in life. And what we can overlook is the potential inequities that contribute to a disability. The World Health Organization explains that a person's environment has a huge impact on their experience with the extent of a disability. More human approach to defining a disability, if you will, is disability results from the interaction between individuals with a health condition and their environmental factors, including negative attitudes, inaccessible environments, and limited social support. Inaccessible environments can create barriers that often hinder the full and effective participation of persons with disabilities in society. So progress on improving social participation can be made by addressing these barriers and facilitate persons with disabilities in their day-to-day lives. So let's take a look at those models I just mentioned. The medical versus the social model of disability. The medical model focuses on how a disability needs to be fixed or cured for a person to have full participation. The problem lies within the person, and it could potentially reinforce ableism that we'll talk a little bit more about here in a moment. The social model, which is more broadly accepted and applied today, focuses on environmental impacts. The medical model framework is still embedded in society in certain areas, but I wanted to touch on just those bullets. The social model focuses on environmental impacts to disability. Limitations are not the cause of the disability, and it's the failure of us to kind of readdress the environment to provide access. So the medical model framework is still embedded in society in certain areas. And some examples of that we can see are videos or print material that are not accessible to individuals with sensory impairments, or websites that are not designed for assistive technology to navigate the page fully. And the relationship that a disabled person has with their environment can be very impactful. It can leave a person feeling thought of and included, or it can leave us feeling isolated and undervalued. So is there an opportunity to reframe the way we think about disability in order to effectively advocate for and facilitate social changes in higher education and in the workforce? So what is ableism? When we talk about ableism, it can be really uncomfortable as its practices are just so ingrained in our world. And as we are talking about it today, I don't want anyone to feel judgment. What I want to do is encourage practices of checking our bias, both unconscious and conscious. I do this on the daily basis and try to think about, re-examining the entire situation to take a holistic viewpoint and kind of determine, where I have come from in the past and what is a fresh light on a current situation. So what is ableism? Ableism puts individuals with disabilities into a group of less than. It simply means that ableism is a societally constructed idea of what is desirable and normal. And what are some forms of disability, of ableism? It could be non-compliance with civil rights laws, not providing reasonable accommodations, or inaccessible media. So from a disability lens, ableism is a set of stereotypes, practices, policies that discriminate against people with disabilities based upon the assumption that typical abilities of non-disabled people are superior or normal. So disabilities can be viewed as one of two things, either tragic or inspirational, again, instead of a normal part of the human experience. And we see this in some of our everyday language, and we all know that language really matters. And so some common microaggressions that are used every day that can also promote ableism are things like sayings like, it's the blind leading the blind, it fell on deaf ears. Phrases like this are really common, but what we need to understand is that they also imply that disability makes a person less than, that disability is bad, negative, or a problem to be fixed, again, rather than something that's normal and inevitable part of the human experience. So how do we then define accessibility? Accessible means a person with a disability is afforded the same opportunity to acquire the same information, engage in the same interactions, and enjoy the same services as a person without a disability in an equally effective and equally integrated manner with substantially equivalent ease of use. The person with a disability must be able to obtain the information as fully, equally, and independently as the person without the disability. And this is the definition that the Office of Civil Rights uses, the Department of Education uses. And there's a couple of different ways that we can achieve this definition of accessibility, and that we can implement it in multiple environments. So what we can do is we can look at our environment and try to design those in such a way that it will be accessible for the majority of people. Or we can then look to find effective, reasonable modifications to policies, practices, and procedures to limit those environmental barriers. If we take a look at the first point, which is, again, to look at our environment, we look at the way it's designed. We want it to work for the majority of people. So an example would be any video that's captioned. It makes this video accessible for folks who can't hear, but also closed captioning benefits so many more people. And just a few examples to share are people who know English as a second language benefit from closed captions because it makes it easier to follow with speech. Closed captionings help with comprehension of the spoken words in many cases. They also help maintain concentration and engagement, which can be helpful for our neurodivergent users. And then the second point, and we don't always think of it in this way, but I want to highlight it. Modifications are accommodations like providing auxiliary services, academic accommodations, work environment modifications. They're really just retrofits to an inaccessibly designed environment that are put into place to create access. And while I won't necessarily say that one form of access is better than the other, through the first form of access, it's built in. There are no further steps needed by a disabled person to gain access. But yet when a modification is required, there's generally a process to apply to ensure eligibility. And that might mean that a person has to disclose personal medical information, and it can just lead to a person feeling maybe an increased fear of being stereotyped or discriminated against. We can use a culture of care to design modifications and create shifts in attitudes that provide access by also removing stigma and just creating an improved experience for everyone. So I do recognize, of course, the importance of accommodations, but when services are provided, we need to remember that they should not be viewed as extraordinary because these services may be needed just to simply accommodate the environment and how it was initially designed. And I'm going to switch it over to Trisha now.
Thanks, Leah. So now thinking about the great information that Leah shared, I'd like for us to consider where can we go and how do we get there? And so I'm going to speak specifically to some things about the importance of our language. The policies related to diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility, which support all learners, and universal design. Importantly, a disabled person should determine how they feel about a disability and how they choose to identify. So let's explore the question, how has disability language evolved over time? Person-first language was really a way to place the person ahead of the disability, and we would say a person who is deaf or a person with autism. Then in the 90s, disability activists began to say a disability was not a secondary characteristic to hide behind a person, but an actual part of their identity to highlight. And the language then evolved to say a deaf person or an autistic person. But we need to realize that this may not fit for everyone, and that is okay. A person who has cancer or other chronic illness may want to use person-first terminology. And the best thing to do in these types of situations is to ask how the person would like to be identified or make note of how they introduce their disability if they choose to do so. Embracing a culture of care supports DEI and A initiatives, which are essential for educational and business entities. Because we know diverse groups are much more innovative and tend to think more creatively, critically, and just generally speaking, it's much more advantageous to have multiple viewpoints working towards solutions. When all voices are represented, the outcomes are always better. Equitable and inclusive practices and policies support diverse populations by welcoming, including and supporting varying abilities, backgrounds, viewpoints, and experiences. An important point that I want to make here is related to the second bullet point. Increased diversity doesn't automatically lead to increased opportunity and access for everyone. And equitable and inclusive environments have to be built. They have to be built in the classroom, in the workplace, in our local community, in our state and federal government, and honestly, globally. Equitable practices focus on attainment of just treatment, access, opportunity, and progress for all in the community. And in order to achieve this, we have to identify and remove barriers that prevent full participation. We create inclusive environments when all individuals or groups are welcomed, respected, and valued enough to be able to participate fully. A question you might be thinking about right now is, well, where can this all be seen in our environment? So I would like you to consider diversity in admissions of students, or in hiring administration, faculty, or staff. Equity could also be available in programs that provide tuition assistance, salary benefits, learning supports and resources in the classroom and our larger university community. At the end of the day, inclusive practices really look at our environment, our interactions, and how we engage with diverse populations. And we can utilize a culture of care as a tool to guide the policies and work to support DEI and the advancement of these initiatives by addressing any issues of injustice related to access for all. The important message to take away from this slide is that we have to be active participants in our communities and work really hard to see others in our community and examine our behaviors and their potential impact. Which leads us to the idea of universal design, or UD. UD is simply the design of environments and products to be usable by all people to the greatest extent possible. Here's a fun fact. Did you know universal design was the brainchild of a disabled faculty member and architect by the name of Ron Mace? Mace coined and passionately promoted the concept of universal design, which in essence is a design philosophy that challenged convention and provided a design foundation for a more usable world through accessible design. So what is on the slide are some examples of universal design: accessible websites, captioning and descriptive video transcripts, automatic doors, curb cuts. UD is a way to facilitate creative solutions to the barriers that exist by learning about and analyzing different environmental variables. Here, we aim to build classrooms and work environments that are inclusive and, as Leah mentioned earlier, proactively minimize the need for accommodations or retrofitting. Our goal here is to allow full participation for all. In essence, providing multiple ways for students to gain knowledge, demonstrate knowledge, and interact with their learning and one another goes a long way toward making course content accessible to all students, including those with disabilities. And actually, for those of you who are not as close to academics, but are staff supporting in various departments, the same is true in our workplace. We should be allowing multiple avenues to complete our essential job duties. It's the key for our collective success and will in turn further our employees' sense of belonging and increase commitment to their work. One example is ensuring all employees have equal access to resources. So how does this tie into our learning environment and specifically our classroom? My answer and approach would be universal design for learning. Universal design for learning principles are based on the 3 network models of learning that take into account the variability of all learners, including learners who were formerly somewhat delegated to the margins of our educational systems, but are now recognized as part of our student population. Providing multiple means of engagement can increase interest and autonomy. We can increase access when we offer alternatives for auditory and visual information. We can also offer increased access to assistive technology tools. A few examples: posting the learning outcomes and expectations for assignments and grading, which I know we do a really great job of in our courses. flexibility with assignment options. I challenge faculty often to think about if there is more than one way to complete an assignment and still demonstrate mastery of the learning outcomes. Providing regular, timely, and substantive feedback encourages students to reflect on what they did well and what they might do to help them do better. And ensuring access to digital and audio text. UDL is a tool to help faculty teach to the variability of all learners and the needs of all learners. When we employ a culture of care and when we develop our courses to be accessible, perceivable, and robust, we are enhancing learning to support a wide range of students. Leah?
All right, so what can we do now? One step at a time, right? So this is just what we could consider like low-hanging fruit, things that we can just start doing every day. We can start by using a culture of care to help us apply an inclusive mindset. So disability inclusion means understanding the relationship to the way between the way people function and how they participate in society. And we want to make sure that everybody has the same opportunities to participate in every aspect of life to the best of their abilities and desires. And if possible, without making a modification. So when we are designing either new learning opportunities or we're thinking about professional development opportunities for our teams, we can try to design those from the beginning with an inclusive mindset to make it as accessible as possible from the beginning. The next thing I would point out is that we all know ourselves best. I think, Angel, you mentioned it in the chat. I really appreciate that you're willing to answer any questions that folks may have. And I really want folks to learn to trust ourselves, our intuition, and to understand that the best thing to do is just to ask a person, ask the student, ask the employee, your colleague, your peers, ask them questions about what works best for them, how they learn best, how they feel most included, and then take that information and put that into the implementation of anything you might be designing. Again, the thought is here, like nothing about us without us. Everybody deserves a voice at the table.
Get creative. When you're thinking about your classroom environment, consider the learning outcomes, the required resources, and the measurements for a course. And then think about all of the various delivery options to provide to students. When we consider the robustness of the things that we have available to us, and we're not afraid to get creative, we don't alter the learning outcomes. We allow students to choose their own adventure, if you will. And this in turn may result in a more engagement in the topic and better retention. And I think it's important to note here that it's not just for students that might have a disability, it's for all students. Network with other professionals. Ask other faculty how they might address a potential barrier or challenge. I encourage all of you to join or attend a professional learning community. One example that I would like to share is all of you are welcome to come to the Development Dish to meaningfully dialogue and collaborate with your peers in a space where like-minded individuals share common goals, and that is success for all.
The next thing you can do is just begin to collaborate with resources. Know your resources, whether it be on campus, in your local community, through human resources. Get involved with folks that you work with to share resources that you know about. It's all about word of mouth in a lot of cases, right? So don't be afraid to reach out and just look through and see what resources might be available in any and every environment.
And I think the last bullet point is really important, and Leah and I have embraced this one, and it's not to be afraid to be wrong, right? Growth and having a growth mindset can sometimes be uncomfortable, whether you're a student, a faculty member, an administrator, regardless of your role, it's important to remember to learn as you go and keep record of what worked well. And don't be afraid to communicate areas of challenge and areas of success, because we all can learn from one another. Environments continue to change, but learning opportunities don't stop.
We're right up to the hour, so that was an absolutely fascinating conversation. We really appreciate your input there. Thank you so much for your time. This concludes the presentation. Dr. Vic's probably has already posted in the chat links to the next set of sessions. So if you want to just click on that to go. And again, thank you all for being here, and thank you to Tricia and Leah for a very informative presentation. Take care, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.